Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today I'm going to bring you some actual history from this book right here, The Life of George Washington, Volume 3, by John Marshall. Now, John Marshall wrote this back when he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court because he admired George Washington so much. He started writing it shortly after Washington's death back in 1799. And so today I'm going to read a story about the attack on the Wyoming settlements. This was an attack made by Iroquois soldiers allied with British Loyalists. So an attack on some of the frontier Patriot settlements back in 1778. About 300 Loyalists, commanded by Colonel John Butler, and about 500 Indians, led by the Indian chief Brant, who had assembled in the north, marched late in June against the settlement of Wyoming. These troops embarked on the Chemung or Tioga, and descending on the Susquehanna, landed at a place called the Three Islands, whence they marched about 20 miles, and crossing a wilderness, and passing through a gap in the mountain, entered the valley of Wyoming, near its northern boundary. At this place a small fort called Wintermoots had been erected, which fell into their hands without resistance, and was burnt to the ground. The inhabitants who were capable of bearing arms assembled on the first alarm at 40 forts on the west side of the Susquehanna, 4 miles below the camp of the invading army. The regular troops, amounting to about 60, were commanded by Colonel Zebulon Butler, the militia by Colonel Dennison. Colonel Butler was desirous of awaiting the arrival of a small reinforcement under Captain Spaulding, who had been ordered by General Washington to his aid on the first intelligence of the danger which threatened the settlement. But the militia, generally believing themselves sufficiently strong to repel the invading force, urged an immediate attack so earnestly that Colonel Butler yielded to their remonstrances, and on the 3rd of July they marched from Forty Fort at the head of near 400 men to attack the enemy. The British and Indians were prepared to receive them. Their line was formed a small distance in front of their camp, in a plain thinly covered with pine, shrub oaks, and undergrowth, and extended from the river about a mile to the marsh, at the foot of the mountain. The Americans advanced in a single column without interruption until they approached the enemy, when they received a fire which did not do much mischief. The line of battle was instantly formed, and the action commenced with spirit. The Americans rather gained ground on the right where Colonel Butler commanded until a large body of Indians passing through the skirt of the marsh turned their left flank, which was composed of militia, and poured a heavy and most destructive fire on their rear. The word retreat was pronounced by some person, and the effects of the officers to check it were unavailing. The fate of the day was decided, and a flight commenced on the left, which was soon followed by the right. As soon as the line was broken, the Indians, throwing down their rifles and rushing upon them with the tomahawk, completed the confusion. The attempt of Colonel Butler and of the officers to restore order were unavailing, and the whole line broke and fled in confusion. The massacre was general, and the cries for mercy were answered by the tomahawk. Rather less than 60 men escaped, some to Forty Fort, some by swimming the river, and some to the mountain. A very few prisoners were made, only 3 of whom were preserved alive, and they were carried to Niagara. Further resistance was impracticable. Colonel Dennison proposed terms of capitulation which were granted by the inhabitants, it being understood that no quarter would be allowed to the Continental troops. Colonel Butler, with his few surviving soldiers, fled from the valley. The inhabitants generally abandoned the country and in great distress wandered into the settlements on the Lehigh and the Delaware. The Indians, as is their practice, destroyed the houses and improvements by fire and plundered the country. After laying waste to the whole settlement, they withdrew from it before the arrival of the Continental troops, who were detached to meet them. To cover every part of the United States would have required a much greater number of men than could be raised. Different districts were therefore unavoidably exposed to the calamities ever to be experienced by those into the bosom of whose country war is carried. The militia in every part of the Union, fatigued and worn out by repeated tours of duty, required to be relieved by Continental troops. Their applications were necessarily resisted, but the danger which threatened the western frontier had become so so immense, the appeal made by its sufferings to national feeling was so affecting, that it was determined to spare a more considerable portion of the army for its defense than had been allotted to that part of the Union since the capture of Burgoyne. On the first intelligence of the destruction of Wyoming, the regiments of Hartley and Butler, with the remnant of Morgan's corps, commanded by Major Posey, were detached to the protection of that distressed country. They were engaged in several sharp skirmishes, made separate incursions into the Indian settlements, broke up their nearest villages, destroyed their corn, and by compelling them to retire to a greater distance, they gave some relief to the inhabitants of the western country. So that's it for this story. This is, again, just about one battle over the Wyoming settlements. I believe this settlement was what the later state of Wyoming was named after, but this settlement was in Pennsylvania, in the western part, where it was sort of exposed to attacks from Iroquois and other Indians coming in from the north who were allied with the British. So if you want to hear more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.